Hello. In my previous video, assessing the paternity of Pope St. Gregory the Great over what we refer to as Gregorian chant, I quoted his decree regulating the choosing of deacons and singers in the liturgy. For 2,000 years until recent times, the popes haven't talked much about music, even sacred music. It has happened only 4 times, strictly speaking, in the history of the Church. But when they have talked about it, it has been about the relationship between the Word and the music that transmits it. Before discussing these papal interventions, it would be remiss not to begin by quoting St. Augustine from his Confessions, written between 397 and 400. He discusses music in Book 10. I used to be much more fascinated by the pleasures of sound than the pleasures of smell. I was enthralled by them. But you broke my bonds and set me free. I admit that I still find some enjoyment in the music of hymns, which are alive with your praises when I hear them sung by well-trained melodious voices. But I do not enjoy it so much that I cannot turn myself away. I can leave it when I wish. But if I am not to turn a deaf ear to music, which is the setting for the words which give it life, I must allow it a position of some honour in my heart, and I find it difficult to assign it to its proper place. For sometimes I feel that I treat it with more honour than it deserves. I realise that when they are sung, these sacred words stir my mind to greater religious fervour and kindle in me a more ardent flame of piety than they would if they were not sung. And I also know that there are particular modes in song and in the voice corresponding to my various emotions and able to stimulate them because of some mysterious relationship between the two. But I ought not to allow my mind to be paralysed by the gratification of my senses, which often leads it astray, for the senses are not content to take second place. Simply because I allow them their due as adjuncts to reason, they attempt to take precedence and forge ahead of it, with the result that I sometimes sin in this way, but am not aware of it until later. Sometimes, too, from over-anxiety to avoid this particular trap, I make the mistake of being too strict. When this happens, I have no wish but to exclude from my ears, and from the ears of the Church as well, all the melody of those lovely chants to which the Psalms of David are habitually sung. And it seems safer to me to follow the precepts which I remember often having heard ascribed to Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, who used to oblige the lectors to recite the Psalms with such slight modulation of the voice that they seemed to be speaking rather than chanting. But when I remember the tears that I shed on hearing the songs of the Church in the early days, soon after I had recovered my faith, and when I realise that nowadays it is not the singing that moves me, but the meaning of the words when they are sung in a clear voice to the most appropriate tune, I again acknowledge the great value of this practice. So I waver between the danger that lies in gratifying the senses and the benefits which, as I know from experience, can accrue from singing. Without committing myself to an irrevocable opinion, I am inclined to approve of the custom of singing in church, in order that by indulging the ears, weaker spirits may be inspired with feelings of devotion. Yet when I find the singing itself more moving than the truth which it conveys, I confess that this is a grievous sin, and at those times I would prefer not to hear the singer. This, then, is my present state. Let those of my readers whose hearts are filled with charity, from which good actions spring, weep with me and weep for me. Those who feel no charity in themselves will not be moved by my words. But I beg you, O Lord my God, to look upon me and listen to me. Have pity on me and heal me, for you see that I have become a problem to myself, and this is the ailment from which I suffer. Well, I'm tempted to stop here, and indeed weep with St. Augustine. After digesting this remarkable text, one is aware that Augustine is articulating a concern that one finds throughout history. He is clearly in favour of music, but he is alert to the possible contradictions between the word and music. Proceeding chronologically, following Pope Gregory in 595, there is a letter from Pope Leo IV. He reigned from 847 to 855, and the letter is to a certain Honoratus, abbot of a monastery not far from Rome, possibly Fafa. To Abbot Honoratus, a most unbelievable thing has sounded into our ears, something which, if it be true, diminishes our rightful dignity rather than adorns it, darkens it more than makes it resplendent. This is, that you hold the sweetness of Gregorian song and the things he has arranged and passed on in the ecclesiastical tradition of singing and reading in such disdain that on this point you are in every way in disagreement, not just with this holy see which is nearby for you, but from practically the whole Western Church, and from all who bring praise and render harmonious sounds in Latin voices to the Eternal King. All these churches have taken up the aforesaid tradition of Gregory with such eagerness and love, and it is so pleasing to them, that even though they received it in full, they do not leave off asking for more of it from us, believing that more of it has remained among us. This most holy Pope Gregory was truly a man of God, a renowned preacher and wise shepherd, and he did very many things for human salvation. It is he who made that sound which we sing in church and everywhere, with musical art and with much labour, to arouse and move human minds more intently in such a way that by the sound of artful melody he would draw to the churches not only the spiritually minded, but even rough and harsh minds. I demand, therefore, that you do not allow yourself to remain in disagreement either with this church, which is the highest head of religion, and from which no one wishes to stray, or with all those churches of which we have spoken, if you love to live in complete peace and concord with the universal church. For if, which we do not believe, your aversion for our instruction and for the tradition of our holy pontiff is such that you are not willing to conform in every point to our right, both in chants and lessons, know that we will repel you from our communion. For it is fitting and healthful for you to follow the usages for which the Roman Church, mother of all and mistress of you, shows such great love and invincible attachment. For this reason we order you, under pain of excommunication, to conform both in singing and reading exclusively to the order instituted in the churches by the holy Pope Gregory and followed by us, and in future to practice and sing it without fail and with the utmost zeal. For if, which we cannot believe, anyone shall attempt by any means whatever to turn you from the right path, by leading you to a tradition other than that which we have just prescribed to you for the present and the future, we not only order that he be deprived of partaking of the holy body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ, but in virtue of our proper authority and that of all our predecessors, we decree that in punishment of his audacity and presumption, he remain under a perpetual anathema. Well, that is refreshingly clear. The next intervention, less often referred to, is by Pope John XXII. He reigned in Avignon from 1316 to 1334 and found himself faced with the explosion of musical invention at the end of the Middle Ages. He intervened in 1324 with a short document on sacred music called Docta Sanctorum Patrem Auctoritas. It is a papal decree sent as a letter to the clergy. The learned authority of the Holy Fathers has decreed that in the offices of divine praise which are offered with the obligation of due service, everybody's mind should be alert, the recitation must not falter, and the modest sobriety of the singers should sing with gentle inflection, for in their mouth resounded a sweet sound. Certainly sweet sound resonates from the mouths of singers when they accept God in their heart. For while they speak to God with words, they also kindle devotion among the faithful with chants. That is why the singing of psalmody was established in the churches of God, namely in order that it may stir the devotion of the faithful. So it is that the night-time and daytime office and the celebrations of masses are sung without ceasing by clergy and people, at a mature pace and using a distinct church mode, so that they can take pleasure in that distinction and delight in that maturity. However, several disciples of a new school, who are exercised about the measuring of time, are intent upon new notes. They prefer to make up their own rather than sing the old ones. The ecclesiastical songs are performed in semibreves and minims, pierced with tiny notes, for they cut up the sounds with hockets, render them gooey with discants, and not infrequently trample upon them with vernacular tripla and motetti, so much so that sometimes they show contempt for the foundations of the antiphonal and gradual. They are oblivious of what they are building upon. They do not know the modes and don't distinguish them, nay rather muddle them together, smothering with swarms of notes the chaste ascending of the plain chant, and its temperate descending by which these modes can be told apart. For they rush and do not come to rest. They intoxicate the ears and give no healing. They mimic what they utter with gestures which ridicule the devotion one comes to find, and they flaunt the very lack of piety one is to shun. Boethius was surely right to say that a lascivious mind takes pleasure in the more lascivious modes, or is often softened and moved upon hearing them. This can lead the faithful to become soft and of unsound mind. This kind of singing must be completely eradicated from the Church. We and our brethren, the cardinals, have perceived for some time that this is in need of correction. To remove it, nay more, to cast it out and to more effectively extinguish it from the same Church of God is what we now hasten to do. Wherefore, by the counsel of the same brethren, we strictly enjoin that from now on nobody should presume to try these or similar things in the offices, especially in the canonical hours or when the ceremonies of masses are celebrated. John the 22nd then specifies punishments for those defying the decree. He does, however, finish in a positive tone. However, by this we do not intend to forbid that now and then, on feast days, especially in the ceremonies of masses and in the aforesaid divine offices, certain consonances that have the savour of melodious sound, such as octaves, fifths, fourths, and such like, may be performed upon the simple ecclesiastical chant. But this must be done in such a way that the wholeness of the chant remains unimpaired, and that no change is made in music of good moral character, especially since consonances of this kind soothe the hearing, stir devotion, and do not allow the minds of those singing to God to become sluggish. This document is very interesting. The Pope reminds us what liturgical music is, and how certain trends risk undermining the word. You won't find better in the documents for St. Pius X, and certainly not in the text on sacred music from the Second Vatican Council. Next we come to the Council of Trent between 1545 and 1563. It mentions music less than is often claimed. It only comments about the intelligibility of the word in musical settings, and that, I quote, "They shall also keep from the churches all those kinds of music in which, whether by the organ or in the singing, there is mixed up anything lascivious or impure, as also all secular actions, vain and therefore profane conversations, all walking about, noise and clamour, that so the house of God may truly seem to be and may be called a house of prayer." We then have to wait until Pope Pius X on November 22nd, Feast of St. Cecilia, 1903, to have another document preoccupying itself with regulating liturgical music. In this letter, Pius X starts by defining the general characteristics of liturgical music, stating, among other things, that it must be holy and must therefore exclude all profanity, not only in itself but in the manner in which it is presented by those who execute it. It must be true art, for otherwise it will be impossible for it to exercise on the minds of those who listen to it that efficacy which the Church aims at obtaining in admitting into her liturgy the art of musical sounds. The Pope then defines the different types of sacred music. He begins with this: "These qualities are to be found in the highest degree in Gregorian chant, which is, consequently, the chant proper to the Roman Church, the only chant she has inherited from the ancient fathers, which she has jealously guarded for centuries in her liturgical codices, which she directly proposes to the faithful as her own, which she prescribes exclusively for some parts of the liturgy, and which the most recent studies have so happily restored to their integrity and purity. On these grounds, Gregorian chant has always been regarded as the supreme model for sacred music, so that it is fully legitimate to lay down the following rule: the more closely a composition for church approaches in its movement, inspiration, and flavour the Gregorian form, the more sacred and liturgical it becomes, and the more out of harmony it is with that supreme model, the less worthy it is of the temple. The ancient traditional Gregorian chant must therefore in a large measure be restored to the functions of public worship, and the fact must be accepted by all that an ecclesiastical function loses none of its solemnity when accompanied by this music alone. Special efforts are to be made to restore the use of the Gregorian chant by the people, so that the faithful may again take a more active part in the ecclesiastical offices, as was the case in ancient times. The letter continues with an approval of classic polyphony, mentioning the works of Palestrina as exemplary in this style. It has a section about singers, another one about the organ and instruments, also one about the length of music, stating that it is not lawful to keep the priest at the altar waiting on account of the chant or the music for a length of time not allowed by the liturgy. Finally, Pope Pius X specifies the principal means of ensuring the execution of the principles laid out, including educating students of theology in, and I quote, the aesthetic side of sacred art, so that the clerics may not leave the seminary ignorant of all those subjects so necessary to a full ecclesiastical education. The Second Vatican Council, which was convened by Pope John XXIII in 1962, spoke explicitly about sacred music in Chapter 6 of Sacrosanctum Concilium, a constitution on the sacred liturgy. It states, "The Church acknowledges Gregorian chant as specially suited to the Roman liturgy. Therefore, other things being equal, it should be given pride of place in liturgical services. But other kinds of sacred music, especially polyphony, are by no means excluded from liturgical celebrations. The typical edition of the books of Gregorian chant is to be completed, and a more critical edition is to be prepared of those books already published since the Restoration by St. Pius X. So we can see that the whole history of liturgical music in the Church is dominated, summed up, by this phrase of St. Bernard: Cantus sensum literae non evacuet, sed fecundet. The melody should not empty the sense of the text, but make it fruitful. There is continuity, clarity, and finesse in all of the writings we have heard about liturgical music during the 1,600 plus years that they span. More recently, in 2001, Pope John Paul II addressed the International Congress of Sacred Music, and for the first time in the history of the Church, he praises the spiritual concert, le concert spirituel. This form of musical expression, he says, which is, as it were, an extension of sacred music in the strict sense, is of particular significance. Beauty is a key to the mystery and a call to transcendence. One might reflect on whether the Church and its musicians have responded fully to this encouragement. To end this presentation, I can recommend the many writings on liturgy and music by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI. He has patiently reiterated the need for the same high standards that we have heard from his predecessors throughout the history of the Church. He has done so in a climate of some hostility. The tact and care that Pope Benedict has brought to this most pressing issue is admirable, a grace in itself. With characteristic intellectual virtuosity, writing in German at the end of the 1980s, he says the following: Faith comes from listening to God's word, But wherever God's word is translated into human words, there remains a surplus of the unspoken and unspeakable, which calls us to silence. Into a silence that in the end lets the unspeakable become song, and also calls on the voices of the cosmos for help, so that the unspoken may become audible. He then says unequivocally, by its nature, such music must be different from music that is supposed to lead to rhythmic ecstasy, stupefying anaesthetization, sensual excitement, or the dissolution of the ego in nirvana, to name just a few examples. Thank you for watching.